Well, good morning to everyone. We still have some people coming in. We should maybe have had two time schedules, one for dry weather and one for wet, because I know there are some people still winding their way to Pepperdine, to Malibu, and even some folks that live here who are winding their way up the hill. You know, we planned this about a year ago, and I still remember the conversations with this morning's panel to build it around when everybody could be here. And most of you may not realize, but this is a time when a lot of academics take a very much needed spring break. That's partly humorous to some people who are not academics. And so we tried to pick a time when a lot of people would be available who might not otherwise be able to come. And so we picked this time. Now, as all of you are no doubt aware, if you follow any television network, this is one of the driest years on history. And I'm trying to think of what's the name of the actor who was the Rainmaker? Burt Lancaster. There are probably some current Burt Lancasters out there that have been praying for rain, and so I don't want to discourage their efforts. We need the rain, and so we're grateful for it, and we'll give thanks for it today. But it is awfully poor timing, and if it were going to rain next Monday, I would take credit for arranging that. But we're glad to have all of you here. Many of you have come from long distances from out of town, and I think it is a tribute to James Q. Wilson that you have made the effort to be here. This is Pepperdine's program here today and tomorrow is in some ways a part of a series. When Jim first passed away 2 years ago, there were a number of individuals, groups, locations which met to celebrate his heritage and his legacy. A number of you who are here today have already written at least one or more articles about Jim's heritage. Within the weeks immediately following his passing, the Bradley Foundation, who has helped to make this possible today, through the Hudson Institute in Washington, I had, I think, maybe at least two, I don't know, John, whether you were on that panel, but I know the other two were there in Washington, D.C. for the Bradley Awards ceremony and a program on James Q. Wilson. One of our local groups here is called Zocalo, which is Zocala, Spanish for town square, I think. Mark Kleiman and Angela Hawken, a couple of people who are on our program today, were part of their program. The Rand Institute, where some of Jim's papers are and some of his library and memorabilia. In fact, there's a James Q. Wilson room at Rand. Susan Marcus, that you'll meet later, is the dean at Rand, is here this morning. They did a program, and a couple of you were on that program. Shep flew in for that. Angela was on the program, I recall. So there have been a series of these, and many, and then Harvard and Boston College did a great series on Wilson's body of work. As you all are very much aware at this point, we've chosen at Pepperdine to focus on one of his books and a series of his essays. His essays, many of them collected in his little volume called On Character, and some others related to that were collected in a subsequent collection called, I think it's Politics Then and Now, a very fine collection of essays, but also primarily on his book, The Moral Sense. I think our bookstore has tried to have some here in case if you don't have a copy, you can buy it while you're here. We felt that this was reflective of much that describes his relationship to Pepperdine. I had been dean of the business school, and when the president of Pepperdine decided that he wanted to launch a school of public policy, he sat down with me and said, "Jim, what do you think about this?" if you're dean of the school of of the business school, almost any university, you consider yourself the cash cow of the whole institution. And there is some truth in that. I was dean of the third largest MBA program, about 3,000 students. And I said, David, I don't think I can support another school. And besides that, I'm just not sure that this is really in our mission to do. Well, he said, if I'm going to do it anyway, what suggestions would you have? And one of the first suggestions I made was that we need to talk to James Q. Wilson, who was living here in Malibu. Jim and Roberta had, I hate to use the word Roberta retirement, but I approached Jim and said, hey, we're thinking about doing this. What if you had a clean sheet of paper, you could design a whole program without any turf battles, no faculty that are tenured to deal with? And he said, Jim, and Harvey, you'll appreciate this, he said, I spent 25 years trying to reform the curriculum at Harvard, and I didn't succeed. And so he was like a child at a candy shop. He can, design the whole program. And I said, well, what about teaching for us? And he said, well, I'll be glad to lecture any of your classes, a whole host of topics we discussed. He said, but I'm not going to be responsible for a class anymore. He said, for two reasons. Number one, you don't pay enough to grade papers. And number two, I have promised Roberta that anytime she decides that it's time to go scuba diving in Australia or wherever, I'm going to be prepared to be able to drop whatever I'm doing, and we're going to take off. This is our time. So Jim did help design the program and was available for lecturing in a number of our classes. We usually started the year every September with some of you will remember an article that Jim wrote back in 1966, 67, I think, for Commentary, called California Country or something like that, explaining to his friends at Harvard what was going on with Ronald Reagan in California. And the gist of that, as I recall, was he was explaining that Ronald Reagan was not a crazy man, but he did give a little disclaimer saying, not that I would necessarily vote for him, to maintain his credibility. Our very first endowed professorship at Pepperdine was made possible by Flora Thornton, a member of our Board of Regents. And after we had made all those arrangements, she called me one day and she said, what would you think if this was not in honor of Tex Thornton, the founder of Litton Industries, but to honor Ronald Reagan? I said, I think that's a great idea. She said, well, I'll call Nancy. And so she called back a couple of hours later. It was fine with Nancy, and she's glad we're going to do it. So when I approached Jim about being the Ronald Reagan professor, I was really prepared to have to do a sales job. And as soon as I mentioned it, he just said, Jim, I'd be honored. So every year we began the school year at the Reagan Library with the Reagan lecture by James Q. Wilson. Mark Kleiman was often in the audience to give him a hard time and ask the embarrassing questions. But that's the role that he played with us. And so it's a real responsibility that we have felt to continue to honor his legacy and particularly to pay tribute to the role that he has played in our program. And so we're here to talk about the moral sense. In Jim's book, The Moral Sense, I have asked Roberta to make a couple of comments. We don't have it on the program, but I just felt like we would all want to hear from Roberta here, and I know many of you will know her and we'll have an opportunity to visit with her the next couple of days. But in Jim's acknowledgments for the moral sense, among other things, he talks about all the people that helped him, the research assistants and the publishers and the agents. But then he says, my wife, Roberta Wilson, read the manuscript and made, as usual, many sensible comments. Doesn't that sound like Jim? Sensible comments. But her contribution to this book long preceded her reading it or even my writing it. though the number of references at the end may lead the reader to think that my views are principally formed by what I have read. By the way, last night I counted there's about 500 references at the back, books. Though the reader may assume that my views are principally formed by what I've read, they were not. They were shaped by living with a remarkable human being for over 40 years. She has taught me by example what the moral sense is. Roberta, thank you for being a part of this, and we're delighted to have you here.
He's embarrassing me, and Jim exaggerated. I'm glad to be here, and I chiefly just want to thank Jim Wilburn and the School of Public Policy for organizing this conference and honoring Jim, and for including me. And I also want to thank all of the participants for agreeing to come this far. Many, many dear old faces in this panel of experts, chiefly these three usual suspects to the left. And I just want to thank you. I will say that I, in preparation for this conference, reread The Moral Sense and the collection of essays on character, and for some reason, Thinking About Crime, which was always one of my favorite books of his. And it was nice to have that all come together, and nothing surprised me, but it just did tie so much together. And I'll be interested to hear what all of you say. I just have one other comment. All during the time that I was the wife of an academic, one thing that always irritated me, although I shouldn't have been irritated, was that we'd be in a gathering and people, inevitably 2 or 3 people would sidle up to me and say, "What does Jim think about something or other?" And I would say, "He's right over there, why don't you ask him?" And so now we'll find out what the panelists could say. I never wanted to say. I knew instinctively what he might think, but I couldn't explicate it. And so I welcome you, and you can have at it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. You're reminding me that, there are some people that we have an office at Pepperdine that the press calls and says, "Hey, there's a big tragedy somewhere in the world. Do you have a faculty member that can comment on it?" And there are some individuals. They've made this comment about a couple of people in Congress. I think that the most dangerous place to be is between them and a camera. And on several occasions, they would ask for Jim. And I would call Jim, and I think 9 times out of 10, he would say, "I just don't know enough about that to comment." And occasionally people would ask him, "What do you think is going to happen with such and such?" And I've heard Jim say this many times. He said, "I have a hard enough time predicting the past, let alone predicting the future." In your packet of materials, there are a number of inserts about other places that have honored Jim and have collections about Jim. One that Shep Milnick and some others have put together is called jamesqwilson.com, and I would commend that to you. They have attempted not only to populate that with their own material, but to include things like we're doing here at Pepperdine, and to link up with a number of people around the country who are doing things on James Q. Wilson. So I commend that to you. And there's material in there from Rand and I think 2 or 3 other places.